Good morning and a very warm welcome to you truth seekers to this third annual Goethe-Göttingen Exchange. This event and the series it is part of goes back to one of the brightest moments in German academia. The moment was when Professor Shachar decided to accept the position as director of the Max-Planck-Institut in Göttingen. And so welcome to all the Göttingen people. It's great to have you here. We originally planned to have this in Göttingen, but the fire authorities shut down part of the institute, and so they had to seek refuge here in our normative orders building, and we're very happy to have you here. That it was one of the brightest moments in German academia and also in my recent academic life, because Ayelet also decided to join the Normative Orders Research Center and is one of our members, which is great for us. And German academia occasionally recognizes its great members and great recent members. So my heartfelt congratulations again, Ayelet, because she received just 2 days ago the best award a German scholar can have, the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Award. So this is a great. So this year we thought we should have a dream team of speakers who discuss with us the edges and the most difficult points about understanding the trends of redefining what citizenship means, the dynamics of citizenship in our time. So we're very grateful that this dream team materialized. I should say that Ayelet speaking was not her dream, that was my dream. So all the others are a collective dream. One of the speakers is just mine. So we're very grateful that you guys accepted our invitations. We're grateful to you for traveling far distances to be here with us. It's also great to have my old friend Bill Scheuermann with us, who came over for a workshop 2 days ago and stayed on. Great to have you here. So I do not just wish, but I do know we will have great discussions of the papers to be delivered, and I look forward to that.
Wonderful. Rainer is really the opener, and I'm just following up, but I could not thank Rainer, because first of all, as you heard, we're refugees here, and we're very, very glad to be welcomed in this very fancy, beautiful building, which we always love spending time here. So thank you for that, and for all the administrative help, everyone who made this possible, because this was complicated and we had to respond really quickly. But also just more fundamentally, for me, there's no better place to celebrate the Leibniz Award, receiving it 2 days ago in Berlin in a very nice ceremony than here at Normative Orders. Rainer, I always tell this when I come here, but I really would have not come to Germany without this connection, having known the kind of fantastic work which is being done here.
You could see we need help, right?
I'm here. The award is coming. So really, this is I have always believed in the excellence of normative orders, despite the DEFGE's decision potentially not to do so, but I really believe in the work that is being done here. It has been a fantastic collaboration that we have had now for several years, and it's true that this year we wanted to talk about the contours of citizenship, and this really is, it's true. Catherine and Cecile, thank you so much, and for all the commentators for coming here. The way Rainer got me to participate, he should have actually spoken, this is the truth, but then he said to me, if we have a you forgot. If we had a lead of 3 women, he said to me, don't you think this would be fantastic? He knows me well enough, so I could not say no to that. So this is how we sort of got to this configuration. This really was his special way of convincing me. But really, I'm really delighted. We have a very large contingency that came from my institute, so I'll just ask you to raise your hands. I'm not going to embarrass you more than that, so people will know who came. So I hope you intermingle with everyone else from the various centers and activities that Rainer has throughout Frankfurt, Germany, the world, and beyond the extraterrestrial connections that you have. But really, more seriously, I do hope that we will continue not just this event. Next year we're planning this year we're doing citizenship. We're hoping next year to do the crisis of democracy, I think, or something along those lines. That's going to be our fourth annual meeting, but also to deepen and strengthen our connections in whichever ways possible. And as I said, special thanks for all of you. I know the semester has not yet started, so we're very pleased that you agreed to join us here, but we're looking forward to a very exciting, interesting, fabulous day in beautiful, rainy, stormy Frankfurt. That part I could not control, and really we hope that we will explore some difficult, interesting issues, and this forum is really open for discussion. That is, we're hoping to have the presentations to commentators and then open the floor to conversation. So we hope to have an intensive, brilliant day, and Rainer, thanks again for hosting us.
Thank you so much.
Last round, but what a wonderful round. Ayelet Shachar herself will present. Of course, I don't need to introduce her, but as the standard way, I will say a few words. So she studied at Tel Aviv University, law and political science, then moved to the United States, got a JSD there at Yale Law School, then received an appointment at Toronto University in Canada, obviously, and then moved up the ladder to the highest degrees. I don't mention all the steps, would take me ages. And then she became, in 2015, the scientific member of the Max-Planck Society and director of the Max-Planck-Institut for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. In addition, she received numerous fellowships and awards, and the most recent, probably, I don't know, probably meanwhile you have received some other else, but that was the Leibniz Prize already mentioned of the DFG, the highest scientific honor you can earn in this country. Her research spans the field of citizenship theory, immigration law, cultural diversity, women's rights law, and law and religion, highly skilled migration, and global inequality. So it's quite a span. She's the author of Multicultural Jurisdiction, Cultural Differences and Women's Rights, Cambridge University Press 2001. Most well known is her book, The Birthright Lottery, Harvard University Press 2009. Located at the intersection of law, economics, and political philosophy, the book crafts new legal concepts and innovative institutional designs to promote global justice, with the aim of ameliorating the most glaring opportunity inequalities that attach to this system of allocation in today's world. She is also the lead editor of the Oxford Handbook of Citizenship and one of the conveners of this nice event. And with further ado, it's your floor.
Okay, I cannot say anything, Stefan, because this is such a generous introduction. It's only going to be downhill from here. I can promise you that. There's no way I could top that. So thank you so much for this generous introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here. It's a Friday afternoon, so to have a full room, it's credit to Rainer's immense power and responsibility and authority and justification reasons, etc. And I want to say that most people, most sane people would not end their Leibniz week on a Friday, 4:30, speaking about their work. So you should again give credit to my co-organizer for his brilliance and perseverance in convincing me to do so. So I'm really delighted to be here. Really, it's just a real pleasure. We love this event. It's our third year, and we're hoping to go who knows how many years, because we really think it's a nice format. And you saw the two initial panels already. So before I turn to the paper, I want to actually thank in advance my two commentators, so Esther and Rainer, and I have to say one thing about each of them before Stefan gives their formal introduction later on. But Esther came to a workshop at my institute, and if any of you are looking for good magic, good karma, you have to follow her lead, because she got the phone call, the offer for her job when she was with us at dinner after the event. So that was a very happy note, and I'm delighted to see that you're doing so well. And with Rainer, he doesn't even remember that we first met at the Harvard conference, the one that Shayla did years ago.
What do you mean I don't remember?
Oh, you remember.
As if it was yesterday.
Fabulous. Because of Shayla. It was such a good event. But he doesn't. The one thing I want to say, that being here and after receiving the prize, and I usually don't like awards, but this was a very nice award, I have to admit. So I feel like I'm walking in the footsteps of giants, and I said, you're a mega giant, so I now have quite a big footsteps to follow. So I'm very delighted that we will end the afternoon with constructive criticism. So any ideas I have about the giant steps will become, will put me down from cloud 9 and bring me back to reality. So I look forward to the commentaries as well as engaging with everyone else. In terms of what I want to do today, so I'm going to present to you, as the title indicates, a talk about the marketization of citizenship. It's part of my long-standing exploration of the transformations of citizenship. And when I think about the transformation of citizenship, I'm thinking about them as occurring along three major axes or spheres: the territorial, the cultural, and the economic. And my focus today will actually be on the third one, on the economic one. But in terms of the context, I think some of you, the ones who were here 2 years ago, was it, at the annual at the whatever the official title is, yes, the official annual conference.
Betriebsausflug, Cluster Betriebsausflug.
Don't embarrass me even more. So I presented the shifting border. I'm very glad that part is being published independently, but it will also be a part of this longer and larger presentation. But as I said, I want to speak about the third dimension, the economic dimension. And I want to begin with the puzzle. And the puzzle is as following. Clearly, anyone who has followed anything about citizenship and migration policy knows that the kind of trend that we have been witnessing over the past few years is a very, very strong trend of restriction. Restriction in terms of entry, restriction in terms of settlement, restriction in terms of naturalization. I can say more about each and every process later on. But I want to suggest that despite this particular trend that we are seeing, and if I had time, I would have talked about specifically about even different categories, how they're restricted: refugees and asylum seekers, partly through the territorial aspect, family members through the cultural aspect, actually connects to Cecile's talk earlier on, and low-skilled migrants facing much greater restrictions to actually standardizing their status once they're in the country. But the one exception, and this is what I'm going to talk today about, is the exception to this rule. That is, despite all these restrictions, we do find one category which enjoys what I will call selective openness. That is openness in relation to so-called high-value migrants who are not only not seeing restriction, they're seeing countries facilitate their entry, proactively facilitate their presence, their entrance, their settlement, and in some cases naturalization. So this is the puzzle that I want to address. How could it be that at the very same time we're seeing a general trend of restriction with this exception of the selective openness, referring to two different categories? Now I have Esther here, so I have to explain what I mean by the high-value migrants. I'm really thinking about two very different categories. The first category would be the human capital entrance. That is people who, as colloquially are referred to, the people who enter on the basis of their brains, skills, and talent. And there's a very, very interesting story to be told there. I'm not going to talk about this category today. I'm not going to talk about the human capital, the high-skilled migrants. The second category is the one I will focus on. That is those who gain what I will refer to as an easy pass to membership on account of the heft of their wallet, their wealth, the depth of their pockets, really, or simply their capital. So this particular category really sees money per se as the facilitator of expedited and simplified either entry or residence and or full access to citizenship through naturalization. And I want to suggest to you that this surge that we are witnessing in terms of golden visas, golden passports, really is one of the most significant and actually, in my view, troubling developments that we are witnessing in the field of citizenship, immigration law, and policy in the past few decades. And by focusing on this particular category of these privileged few, the global 1%, those who really are defeating the odds, and I'll show you a video in a minute. I knew I had to keep you awake, so I brought some entertainment. Just we'll get to that in terms of the empirical data. But clearly, these are individuals who are defeating the odds faced by the less privileged many. And I hope what we can do in the next, 35 minutes that I have or so, is really take you with me on a journey that tries to identify the core empirical, legal, and normative puzzles that are associated with this new trend, and I'll refer to this trend as the Marketization of Citizenship in order to try and capture a dual transformation that I'm thinking about. The first aspect is commodifying access to membership, so that's the first dimension of marketization here. And the second one is, and to some extent to me actually the more troubling one, is the hollowing out of the status, rights, and identity components of citizenship. So it's really these two aspects that I'm trying to capture by this particular term, the marketization of citizenship. Of course, it could mean other things, and there are different ways in which citizenship is marketized, so I'm going to talk only about these two aspects here. And even more specifically, I really want to show how the tools of public law, that is legislation, regulation, case law, have really become key tools in reinventing some of the classic aspects of sovereignty and democratic self-determination, by which I mean to refer to the classic question of citizenship and immigration law, that is defining who belongs or ought to belong, and of course, even the harder question, according to what criteria. And I want to suggest to you that putting visas and passports per se for sale is never merely an economic process. If you were to read the literature, and there's actually a surprisingly large literature defending these kinds of practices, most of it actually coming out from the industry that's benefiting from these kinds of sales, but we can talk about that later on. The intermediaries here play a very, very significant role. So they were trying to present it as a mere economic process. I want to suggest to you that it's also deeply political. It's deeply political because it reshapes and re-engineers the boundaries of an interaction between states and markets, voice and power, the political and the pecuniary. So I really want to suggest that because of all of these aspects, and especially the political aspect, to some extent these programs are testing our deepest intuitions about the meaning of and the relationship between the individual and the political community to which she belongs. So I want to suggest that this is, for us, an interesting test case to really reflect back and think about citizenship more broadly. And in terms of how I want to divide my time, first I want to give you some of the empirical context, then I'll move to the normative. Actually, in the piece that I circulated, I have 3 arguments in favor of citizenship for sale, 3 arguments against. In the interest of time, I'll just go for the arguments against, although if I have time, I'll try and sneak one of the ones in favor, because I think it for me, partly sets up the stage. I have to say that when I wrote this piece, many of these arguments are my articulation of what I think the defenders would say. There's not enough really articulated conceptually, so it's my interpretation thereof, but I think it represents quite fairly well, I think, what these arguments would have been if someone would have phrased them. And if time permits, I'll also try and explore what kind of legal, institutional, as well as democratic political responses what kind of contestation might be relevant in reference to this particular kind of marketization process. And if I don't have time to do so during the talk, please someone ask me, so I'll have an excuse to tell you a little bit about the different strategies that I think we could use. So first of all, the empirical part. So I want to give you a sense of these changes and why I think they're dramatic. So citizenship for sale programs, the topic of my discussion, are clearly booming in recent years. Close to half of the world's countries have introduced some form or another of fast track for the rich programs. These are programs that allow you to legally obtain, this is all legal, none of this is done under the carpet. These are states changing their laws or regulations to achieve this, to legally obtain a residence or citizenship in a new country, and you would gain that citizenship or residence in exchange for a very substantial investment. In some cases, you'll see this referred to as a donation. I'm going to stick to the term investment. They really are interchangeable. And once this is done, in the process to permit this way of purchasing citizenship, the individuals who would gain from it are permitted to jump the queue. That is, they are out of the regular process. They benefit from exemptions to standard entry, settlement, and naturalization requirements. And in some cases, and this is really quite dramatic for at least for someone like me coming from citizenship theory, the millionaire migrants, that is the ones who are benefiting here from these privileged pathways, don't even have to set foot. They don't even have to visit their new country of citizenship. This whole transaction could occur through a lawyer and your wire transfer. You basically have to click the button and actually send the money in order to gain membership. And while the specific details of different countries' programs clearly vary, and if we had more time, we could really go more systemically and see how they vary, because I think it's actually quite interesting. But today I want to explain what is actually shared across these different programs, and they do share one basic premise. That is, the idea is that the uber rich, and again, you'll see the sums in a minute, so this is really tailored for very, very wealthy individuals. The idea is that these individuals, even if they have only very tenacious, very minimal contacts or relationship to the passport issuing country, will acquire an opportunity to acquire either residence or citizenship based on nothing more, and this is what is really unique to these programs, nothing more than the heft of their wallet. So it's really just their wealth, which permits them to bypass standard residence, which most countries actually enforce these quite jealously, linguistic proficiency requirements, any kind of establishment of links to a given country, knowledge of the political system, civic integration, any such related tests and requirements that states really in the past few years have ratcheted up all of these requirements. For this particular category, they're just thrown out the window, they're exempt, and this again requires a significant amount of legislative work to say, for everyone else, we think we really need you to know the language in order to participate. We definitely think that you need to have some basic knowledge about the democratic system in order to become a citizen. All of that is waived, oftentimes actually without sufficient, in my opinion, any democratic accountability that we could really trace. In some cases, against the express will and the sense of public opinion of the given country in which these kinds of changes are occurring. So just to give you a sense of the sum, so still on the empirical side. So the UK, for example, has had a long program of selling the golden visas, what in the UK I refer to as the tier 1 investor category. This investor category requires a minimum investment of 2 million British pounds. I'm sure all my colleagues here are very wealthy. I don't think any of us could really, even with the Leibniz.
Now you can.
Sure. All the research monies of Germany will go there. So 2 million British pounds. And what you obtain in the UK Golden Visa version is what is technically known as a leave to remain in the UK. That gives you later on the possibility to naturalize should you wish to do so. And the UK also has a very interesting, actually very, in a way, you know, all of these programs for me as the lawyer and the sort of institutional designer, they're so brilliant that I sort of have this dual, you know, affection to them. I sort of love them and I hate them simultaneously, but the design aspect is just so strong. So I have to tell you one thing about this. So in the British UK example, clearly they had a review first. It used to be 1 million British pounds. They had a commission that actually explored this and said, no, this is way too cheap. We can actually go higher. They went for 2 million as the baseline. But the economists who planned this said you could even go higher. So you can have the 2 million as the basic tier. You can enter with 5 million or 10 million. 10 million British pounds. Remember, this is free money. This is your mobile capital that you can move. It cannot be your assets that are property or anything like that. This is extra money that you have. So this is why I'm saying it's a global 1%. These are very, very wealthy individuals who are targeted. If you do the 2 million, you have to wait for 5 years. If you do the 5 million, I think it goes down to 3 years. If you do the 10 million, it's 2 years. So it's a scale. Time is here sort of comparable to money. The more you pay, the less time you have to wait. So just to give you a sense of how sophisticated in terms of the design these programs are. This particular program in the UK came under quite a good amount of critique a couple of months ago for very, very, very familiar concerns and serious concerns about money laundering, tax evasion, and corruption. All the programs that I'm familiar with across the world have always come under the same critique. Despite that, these programs are still running. There was a moment in the UK actually around December when they thought that they would close down the program very quickly. There was again the industry and some good, very strong lobbying that actually now maintain this program. It's still in operation. I want to suggest to you that these concerns about corruption, lack of due diligence, money laundering, fraud, etc., have been with these programs from their initiation. They actually started, there's a very interesting history in the early 1980s, mostly in the Caribbean and Pacific microstates, which really saw this as a way of survival, selling their passports for individuals who were looking at the time, these were referred to as passports of convenience. And again, these programs were deeply prone to abuse. But I think the interesting point about that is why people would actually purchase them. People were looking themselves to evade taxes, to evade financial reporting requirements in their home country, in some cases to get a new identity, and just to get more flexibility in terms of visa-free travel, should they, if this was something that they were interested in. So we see the very same kind of motivations today. We also see the same kind of concerns. But as I said, I think what has really changed is the citizenship trade per se. There are a tremendous amount of for-profit actors which are just trying to smooth these kinds of concerns and to suggest that they are no longer with us. I do think that the empirical evidence doesn't suggest that, but we can talk about that later on. Just to continue with our quick tour in terms of other programs, the United States has a program that's referred to as the EB5 category. EB stands for employment-based, so the U.S. has different 5 categories. This is the 5th one. It requires an investment of $1 million US. If you invest in certain areas, which are supposed to be deprived areas, poor areas, the sum goes down to $500,000. De facto, now everyone only invests $500,000, and they hardly ever invest in poorer regions of the country. But that's, again, a complicated story that I could tell you later on. But this is the nominal amount, $500,000. In Europe, the going price, depending on the specific country, is usually a little above 1 million euros if you're entering a member state. The Maltese example is the most famous one, where you would indeed pay a little over 1 million. Nominally, you have to be a citizen for a year, but basically you just have to rent a unit. You don't really have to move to the country, and then you will gain your Maltese citizenship. You can imagine, say, a Russian oligarch is not really very deeply interested in Maltese citizenship. What they're looking for is the back door to a European passport. So this is the story of this particular program. I want to suggest that, to some extent, just to go back to the initial puzzle that I mentioned to you earlier, just at the same time that in the United States the EB5 program has to be renewed every several months, this was renewed under the Trump administration, very closely in time to a decision that was made to stop another program that you might be familiar with, which is referred to as the DACA program. This is the Deferred Action for Children, which referred to children who were brought to the country at a very young age, who have actually stayed in the country for the vast amount of their memorable experience as growing up as adults. These individuals lost their status, which is a protected status, at exactly the same time that the EB5 was renewed. So just to give a sense that this contrast is real, it's real in the policy arena, and we have to try, I think, to explain and reason through these developments. So as I said, well-off states tighten and impede passage through their gates for most categories of would-be immigrants, including refugees, by the way, who have the strongest legal claim, who are in dire need of protection, while at the very same time we're finding countries proactively introducing and copycatting. That is, once one country does it, another country wants to benefit from the same ideas, and we're just seeing countries facilitating this fast-track entry into various countries. And again, privileging the world-moneyed elite. And if you look at the literature coming again from the industry, they would say that these very wealthy individuals wish to diversify, that's the term that they use, I love it, diversify their passport portfolio. So that's the rationale for why we have this. Now, I want to suggest that Europe is a case in point. Europe is really surprising. It's the origin of sort of nationalism originally, and then, of course, supranationalism, now supranationalism. But Europe has been a major player. Currently, 20 of the member states actually have designated immigrant investors category. 3 countries have citizenship for sale straight up. And globally, as I said, depending on how you count these programs, I'm using here a generous count, more than 80 countries actually are involved in the citizenship trade. So this is what I promised you about the video. So I want to just show you the timeline and just for you to see these changes. So you remember I mentioned to you that originally these programs start in very small micro states, both the Caribbean and the Pacific. So this is roughly early 1990s. So you'll see, so there's a small sort of gradual growth. You saw Great Britain there. So Great Britain and Canada were among the early movers, actually before the United States introduced its EB5. And then we're getting to the 2000s. So watch what is happening now. So still we're seeing quite a variety, and you even don't really see a concentration in terms of regions. But look at what happens roughly at around 2010. We're really seeing quite an explosion here of these programs. You see it here, 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 and they're just growing. This is what I mentioned to you. Once countries learn about this, the same facilitators actually wear 2 hats. They would sell citizenship. They also advise governments about how to introduce this. This graph is actually updated. The visual here is updated up to 2018. We're only in March, and I actually have to update this. There are at least 3 new countries. So just to give you a sense, this is why I said I think empirically this is a significant process, and I hope I've convinced you it's a serious phenomenon. Now, beyond the concerns that I've already mentioned, just in the interest of time, I want to move to some of the additional lines of critiques that could be advanced against putting these visas and passports for sale. And again, my critique here is going to be normative, but as I said, we could use even a broader range of arguments. But just before I turn to the critique, I want to tell you what are the three arguments that I develop here, in the sense of, not that I defend them, but I want to try and spell out what could be the arguments in favor of selling citizenship. The first one is actually my favorite one. I labeled it taming nationality. I think this is the one that economists would definitely put to the fore. They would say, all of you political theorists, you're such, you're so romantic. You think that states and bureaucracies are so wonderful, and that democracy and what have you is functioning. They would say, these are, they don't like centralized control, and they would say instead what we need to do is transfer this to individual autonomy into a market allocative, much more efficient mechanism of market transactions, where agents would really show how much they value citizenship by paying. That is, how much would you pay? Whomever pays more would show that they care more about citizenship, and they would believe that the market would actually gravitate us towards ideal results. That is, because their sorting mechanism is the ability to pay or the willingness to pay, they would think that whomever pays more shows that they care more about this citizenship, and their image is that citizenship would be freely sold and bought on the market. They would really have a free market, or at least some of them would think about it as a free market for scarce and valuable goods. And again, that through repeated actions, we will get to the right price. We will know which citizenship is more valuable than another. Now, I should mention that none of these economists take into account any background conditions. So the fact that none of us could pay 2 million British pounds doesn't account into showing that we might, really value a particular citizenship. That sort of falls off the radar screen. I think there are also, of course, various other questions of, can you actually do this valuation? Can you really translate something with non-monetary goods, such as citizenship, into this very commodified, sort of unified measure of a dollar amount? What happens to all the non-monetary values, the human kind of relations, social interactions, political commitments that we have that are part of citizenship? So this doesn't fit into this model, obviously, but I just want to present it to you because I want you to know that these are parts of the arguments that are out there. Another, the most extreme version of this argument would say that not only states should sell citizenship, private individuals should be able to. This should be on eBay, right? You could just sell your German citizenship and for the highest bidder. Obviously, if you do that, it's quite illegal. Don't dare do that. It's a federal offense, so I don't want to sound as if I'm suggesting this is possible. States have never surrounded their monopoly. In fact, I read the fact that they're selling citizenship for such a high amount as it's not a theoretical critique. I think it's just a factual, descriptive, empirical point to say that the theory about the demise of the value of citizenship just doesn't hold if people are willing to pay such amounts. It just shows us that I think this, of course, it's a very prevalent argument. I think that it could not fit with the empirical reality that we're witnessing here. And also the market for citizenship remains fully stated. States have not given up on their control. They are the ones who define the numbers. They define the amounts that you have to pay, the speed of receiving your visa or your passport, and also various other technical aspects of this, although they have delegated some of it to, as I mentioned to you earlier, various intermediaries, mostly global law firms that are doing some of their transactions for them. So this would be the economic argument. As I said, I find it personally non-persuasive for a host of reasons, including the fact that even if you're worried about, love of patria as being your concern as against nationalism, you don't really need to commodify citizenship. We know that we have dual nationality, we have supranational, we have EU citizenship, which has, for some, is an expression of post-nationalism. We have multiple citizenship. We have so many different ways of saying that we have different mechanisms of, even if we're worried about nationalism being too closely associated with citizenship, there are different ways to address that. You don't really need to go to a market mechanism. But, we can talk about these later on. In terms of the three critiques that I want to share with you, the first one that I'm worried about is, I think, a pretty straightforward one is about exacerbating inequality. And I want to talk about different multiple layers or levels of inequality that might be relevant here. The first one is, of course, the global one. That is, there are high levels of wealth inequality that exist throughout the world, and enabling some individuals, really individuals who think nothing of paying millions for a passport to gain a passport, while others can barely find the means to survive. Just seems to be a deeply unfair and unequal mechanism of distributing something as valuable as citizenship. And as I mentioned to you earlier, these programs are clearly tailored for the super rich. That is, states are not trying to sell citizenship to your average Joe. They're targeting very, very wealthy individuals and putting at a disadvantage, just adding yet another disadvantage for individuals who might want to move across borders. If they were, just to use my own terminology, I would say they got the short stick in the birthright lottery. So these individuals who might have already been disadvantaged in the initial allocations say that they might want to move. So adding these economic barriers makes it close to impossible for you to change your initial allocation of membership. Now, citizenship also, or inequality also operates on different levels, not just the global one, also the transnational level. That is, if you were to think about different categories of individuals, of immigrants. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, we're all too familiar with the kind of political backlash that we have seen against immigrants, the rise of xenophobia, of populist nationalism, putting greater pressure on governments, if anything, to further tighten and restrict access. So this is the global reality in which we're operating. And within this set of existing restrictions, while these restrictions are being introduced, and as I said earlier, they are affecting the most vulnerable categories of potential migrants, including refugees, family members, individuals who are low skilled, that is, who might be vulnerable in the workplace to begin with in terms of exploitation. So all of these categories are seeing greater, tighter restrictions. At the same time, we're seeing what I've showed you in the video, these skyrocketing proliferation of golden visas and golden passport programs, offering clearly a preferential for the rich kind of route. So there's this concern about different categories of would-be migrants. How could we explain that and the inequalities that occur among these different categories of individuals, which might be different from the general concern I've raised earlier about just the global inequality. Now, I also want to suggest that there's another puzzle. That is, some of the countries that have been most vocal in terms of their anti-immigrant policies have also been the countries that have been very comfortable, with one hand saying we close the door, with the other hand saying, but we'll open this window and you can jump through if you bring us a sufficient cash. And I'll just give you two examples. The first one is Hungary, and really Hungary is a great example because we know it has really taken politically the lead step in saying we think that our country should not be open to at least refugees and asylum seekers, and also they're trying now to convince, to create this European coalition of holding this very strong anti-immigrant campaign. So the very same Hungary that has not complied with the very limited number of refugees that they had to receive under the relocation plan that Europe devised. The same Hungary between 2013 and 2017 granted 24,000 residence permits. This is a very, very high number of golden visas to have been issued in such a short period of time before this program closed down in 2017. I want to remind you, if you don't remember, the number of refugees that Hungary refused to accept was 1,300 refugees. So this is the number they were not willing to accept. In fact, went to literally a war with the European Union, had a court decision against them, while at the same time granting 24,000 residence permits, roughly the same period of time. For a host of reasons, this program was closed down, but just to give you one concrete example. Another example is Malta, which again is very interesting in this discussion because Malta brought the Caribbean model to Europe in the sense of explicitly selling citizenship. And its passport is still for sale. You would have to pay, as I mentioned earlier, a little over 1 million euros to be granted really speedy access to European Union citizenship. And this particular program has been taken up quite enthusiastically. The most recent data that I'm familiar with, it's actually very, very hard to get the data from the governments. They don't want to reveal the data of who's getting, which countries are the sending countries, the numbers. But this particular data I have because it was retrieved actually by the European Parliament Research Services, and their data shows that 38% of the naturalization in Malta over the past 2 years were naturalization which were based on citizenship for sale. So that's a very, very hefty percentage of the naturalizations occurring in this country. And again, you have to remember that Malta has also, just like Hungary and other countries, I mean, this is not singling out Malta, we know this is occurring across the board in Europe, has very much tightened its restrictive policies against asylum seekers. And the most recent number of the comparable period of time is 131 refugees which were accepted by Malta. So again, just showing this deep stratification across migration categories, which I think we should take into account, and exacerbating, as I mentioned earlier, the initial unequal allocation of access to citizenship. And also I think it's individuals who gain citizenship for sale, this is a want from them. It's in most cases, it's not a need. If you're a refugee, this is a real need. This is your basic protection, your basic survival in many cases. So it's almost grotesque in the kind of policies that we actually have in action in the world around us. Just 2 other points quickly on the inequality. Domestically, you might say, we've had the global, the transnational, but I also want to suggest that domestically there are concerns with inequality. That is, if countries do, as they do, grant expedited, simplified access to membership for some in exchange for a very significant amount of money, it might actually create inequality among different classes of members. Let's assume that you even gain citizenship. The kind of citizenship that you gain usually is, again, it's not just that the access is different, also the kind of responsibilities that come with citizenship are different, meaning that in most cases these individuals don't have to pay taxes, whereas a standard citizen, has to pay taxes. They often are exempt from any kind of contribution to civil society. This would include even jury service. So basically, as I see it, this is really free riding on the good reputation of the given country in which whose passport these individuals purchased. They have no genuine links to the country and really try and only share the benefits and not the risks of membership. And I might get back to that later on if we have some more time. And obviously, these are disparities that raise important questions of democratic voice, of participation. In some countries, these parachuted citizens, actually, they don't have to pay taxes, but they do get to vote, which again raises a lot of perversive incentives here. Also, if you make binding decision over a particular community because you're now an official citizen, you might make decisions based on perhaps your short-term interest or who knows, but you clearly have a way out, an exit, which someone who's a monoculture or mono-citizen, someone who has no multiple citizenship does not have. And that again just creates inequality, not just in access, but also in voice and exit capacity. So if we were to use Albert Hirschman here. So this is also significant in the sense of the inequality occurring within a country once you've already been admitted. And the last point that I'll make about inequality is that among European member states, and this is really special to the EU because supranational EU citizenship is the most advanced form of supranational citizenship that we're familiar with in the world, the willingness of actually a very small number of member states to really blatantly commodify citizenship. So I would distinguish here between just the golden visa, getting residency, and gaining very straight access to citizenship. Clearly what these countries are selling, as I mentioned earlier, is access to EU citizenship. And this raises a whole set of, to me, questions of justice, of fairness, of democratic accountability, in the sense of if what you're gaining is access to supranational citizenship, who should you consult with? That is, should you get the consent, justification? I mean, I'm looking at Reiner. So is it, do you owe any duty of justification to someone else, including other member states, to the European Union entities? We could expand that. What about these would-be entrants that are being pushed to the back of the line because they cannot pay? So, once we open up these questions, it becomes quite complicated. I don't have time to speak about that. Again, if you want to ask me any questions, do so during the Q&A. But I think these are significant issues which have not yet been addressed, and clearly they need to be addressed. So the second set of concerns is somewhat different. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Here we're talking about what we can refer to as the intrusion of the market into the political sphere and hitting at the heart of the sovereign act of delineating the contours of the demos. So this is why it's significant. Obviously, we have marketization occurring in different arenas all the time, but this is really striking at the question of who belongs. It's the most foundational question that we typically think about as the self-determining, the self-determination. So this is significant. Now, I want to suggest to you, and this echoes what I said earlier on, so that not everyone would object to this development. That is, as I mentioned earlier, economists who would view the market as the best sort of locale for promoting individual decisions and choice would see this as a very welcome advance. And indeed, I want to mention one person who I never got to meet, which I regret, Gary Becker, of course, the late Gary Becker, because he famously endorsed what he called the economic approach to human behavior. And his claim, it's a very robust claim, was that the economic approach to human behavior which he developed should apply to all, emphasizing all human behavior and regardless of what goods are at stake. So his really was an expansive across the board kind of vision of having economics govern every aspect of our life. And on this rationale, obviously nothing prohibits selling entry permits, right? Because it's all human behavior regardless of what goods are at stake. And of course he was an American, and I should mention to you, the day after he won the Nobel Prize in Economics, I don't know, none of us won the Nobel Prize, but I guess you can do anything you want the day after you win the Nobel Prize, right? What he chose to do was to write an op-ed which really basically said we should sell entry permits into the United States. So he was clearly committed to this idea of commodifying everything, including access to membership. And I think that as much as Becker and many of his followers, they would like to claim that our resistance to citizenship for sale is, or replacing entry visas, residency permits, or citizenship up for sale. I think their position would be that we're objecting to it because it's not what we're accustomed to. Our intuition is to oppose that. This is so novel, they would say, that this is the reason why we're opposing it. It's counterintuitive. But I want to suggest that that cannot be right. That is, I think there are deeper and actually more profound reasons for objecting, and not just a newness of it, as would be the claim of the economists here. And my argument here is actually quite an old-fashioned argument. That is, citizenship as we know it, at least since the time of Aristotle, you know, it has always been about political relations. And as such, this kind of relationship is expected to reflect and potentially generate notions of participation, of co-governance, of risk-sharing, of potentially some measure of solidarity among those who are constituting the body politique. And it is quite difficult to imagine how these democratic and relational and reciprocal kind of commitments can be preserved under circumstances in which the distinction between the insider and the outsider becomes their ability to pay a certain price. So it's, again, some would try and challenge that, but I think my objection here is to this notion that everything, including political membership, is indeed commensurable and reducible to a dollar value, is something that I think with citizenship, there's something distinctive about it. Now, this is why I said earlier on, still the burden is in this particular case on me to show what is it that's unique to citizenship which cannot be commodified. But I want to suggest that there's something that just putting a price tag or just turning citizenship into a commodity, there is something that will be lost in this kind of transaction. That leads me quickly to the third point of my critique, and I'll close very quickly, is that this is a concern about what we could call, I actually don't like this title, something like the character of citizenship. If you have a better idea, please tell me what would be a better name. But the intuition here is that if you just, if a stack of cash really becomes the surrogate for membership, something about the basic connection between the individual and the political community is unfastened. That is, cash for membership programs detach the notion of citizenship from any meaningful kind of connection, or what I elsewhere called eusnexia, and I would define it here actually quite expansively, that it could be extended residency, it could be an emotional attachment, it could be a personal commitment, but there has to be some kind of a special connection between you and that particular community in order to justify that allocation or that status of membership. And here I'm relying on Roger Smith, who observed that the oldest, most basic, and most prevalent meaning of citizenship is a certain sort of membership in a political community. So I think there's something about that political community and our relationship to it which is significant. And here, as I said, I'm not going to talk about human capital, but if I were to do the distinction between human capital and capital, I would say human capital on this ground fares better. If you move based on your talent, you yourself have to move into a new community and establish a set of relationships there. What happens with capital is, you, as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to move. Your money moves, but it's totally detached from the person. So I think this aggravates this concern that I have about the political relationship that is significant for the institution and ideal of citizenship. Now, of course, I don't want to appear, as a Pollyanna here, in the sense that, of course, we know that the historical record of access to equal membership is a terrible record. That is, that citizenship has never been open to all, and we know that it still is actually, we could make a claim that it's still not fully equal in terms of access. But at least we have, as part of our repertoire, as part of our intellectual vocabulary, this idea, this this aspirational or emancipatory idea that everyone should be included, even if we fail in practice. And this particular ideal, I think, has a tremendous staying power. And of course, also the scale of citizenship has changed, right? We know that in some periods in time, it's attached to a city-state. It could be an empire-level kind of relationship. So I don't even think that the political relationship have anything to do with statehood in any way. But the point is that there has to be a political set of connections. And here, the unique and reciprocal bond between the individual and the state and the political community, or again, it could be other level of governments. That is, if we're thinking about multiple conceptions of citizenship, obviously you might have a relationship to the European Union qua union or to your locality. So this could operate on different levels of analysis and of different levels of connection. But I think there's something about that bond that distinguishes citizenship from other kinds of relationships. And just to throw a couple that we could think about, right? We could think about the master-slave. Clearly, we think that citizenship is quite different from that, from emperor-subject. We spoke about post-colonialism earlier on and the decolonization process, the producer-consumer, even supply and demand relationships of private provision and consumption. There has to be something different about citizenship, which again, it might be hard for us to actually put the full package and say what it is, but I think the intuition is there that clearly something would be lost if we just put citizenship for sale, period. And partly I think what changes about citizenship when it becomes just a result of a monetary exchange is not just a price tag. This is where a lot of the debates are. What is the right price for citizenship, etc. I don't think that's the point. I actually really think it's the expressive, or what you call the communicative kind of function or message of how and why we actually value these relationships in the first place. So I'm not so worried about what is the right price tag as much as about what it really means about the relationship themselves. And clearly, given here wearing my lawyer's hat, laws, clearly they don't just simply define categories and guide action, right? They also constitute that which they purport to describe. And likewise, markets do not just allocate goods, they also express and promote certain attitudes towards the goods that are being exchanged. So as I read these government programs which authorize a market for purchasing and selling access to citizenship, I see them as sending quite a clear message about at least what policymakers would see as their potential best future citizens or ideal citizens. That is, they're giving a preference to credit lines over civic ties. And I see, as I mentioned earlier, this global surge in global visas, global passports, not just as exacerbating global inequality, but also, at least if you take this, to its logical conclusion, this could also, if it really catches up, it could provide a pretext and intellectual ammunition, so to speak, for anti-emancipatory narratives, right? Because you could say that citizenship could be denied for those who cannot afford to pay the exuberant price, right? So this is not at all the situation that we're facing today. No one is suggesting that we go back, to these notions of property and social class, but of course we know this was part of the history of citizenship. It's a dark history. It could revive itself, and this again just provides, once you go on the positive side, why not get in? You could also make exactly the reverse argument and say, well, if you cannot pay up or if you don't have sufficient property, then why should you be treated as an equal citizen? So I'm really worried about this. Again, this is a very long term. I don't see this happening in our lifetime, but I think that the seeds are there for making reviving these kinds of arguments, which have been very hard to kill in the first place. And again, if I just go back to the example that I started with in the US context, and then I'll close. You remember that I mentioned to you the EB5 category, the parachuters, the individuals that can just come in based on their money, putting $500,000, and actually they get it back, which is absolutely absurd. After 5 years, they just lose the interest, they get it back. So this is a freebie to get into the US. At the same time that you have the dreamers, the children who have really been raised American, that everything that they know about themselves is a connection to this particular political community. They have no legal way. It's not just a civic or political democratic concern. They have no legal way to even ensure that they are not deported. That is, they don't even have the most basic security of staying in the country, let alone establishing permanent residency or citizenship. So this is what I mean by the distinction between credit lines and civic ties. And as I see this development, clearly it's putting more emphasis on the credit lines than on the civic lines. So let me close with the following thought. I think personally, because I value citizenship, I still think that there's plenty of room for reinventing and reinvigorating citizenship at all levels, the local, the regional, the national, the supranational level. And I think it should be opened up to new members. I think it should be opened up to new ideas of participation across borders. But clearly these for sale programs, they're definitely not part of this inclusionary driven trend to reimagine the boundaries of the demos and the franchise. If anything, these golden visas vindicate a transactional, an instrumental, a wealth-based exclusionary vision of access to citizenship as a purchased commodity. And I would also say this, I don't have in the paper, but I am actually quite worried about the current political moment, because you can see how a populist nationalist, for example, could think about these programs, someone who feels that they're left behind, either culturally or economically. They could see this as the most cynical manifestation of all the ills that they believe about corrupt elite, whether domestically or globally. So I think there's also that additional concern in a world in which we're worried about xenophobic and anti-immigrant kind of sentiments, and about tightening the question of who belongs and does not belong. I think these economic categories could also be turned into quite problematic and deeply, they could be pretexts again for just finding new reasons to hold positions against migrants and minorities. So, as I said, I'm worried about these programs because they privilege those who are already better off, they risk eroding equality at different levels, and they take away something significant from the idea of citizenship as grounded in the realm of political relationships, as grounded in everyday civic ties. And allowing wealth to become this new golden passport to citizenship could leave us with a world in which, as Oscar Wilde once put it, too many of us know the price of everything and the value of nothing. So I think I've exceeded my time a little bit. Thank you very much.